I'm going to be speaking about an episode of modern historical study on my part, which has to do with episodes of 19th century historical study, and you will see how one thing leads to the other. But of the three items which I list in the title of the lecture, the superfluous comma of Philipp Jaffé, and the birth of modern German antisemitism, you recognize there's a great difference of proportions between the first two and the third. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to point this out. In the end, it'll all be going towards questions of what do you mean about historical causation? Do things happen because of reasons, or do they happen because of circumstances? And Professor Liska told me that people like to have discussions after lectures, so maybe that will be the broader topic that might come up in that discussion. So I will begin. These are two of the main protagonists of the story. Heinrich Graetz, the Jewish historian. Let me ask, how many of you read German or know German? Most of you? Okay. I also read German, so or so. Well, we'll survive. And on the other hand, Heinrich von Treitschke, the German professor of Prussian history and modern German history in Berlin, who played a role as an antagonist to Graetz in the story I'm going to tell you. But my field is, like Professor Liska said, my field is the study of ancient Jewish history. And I spend a lot of time working on Josephus Flavius Josephus, the books of Maccabees. And I was working on that more than 10 years ago when this story was born. I was minding my own business. I had been asked to write a paper on modern Jewish views of Flavius Josephus. And I was reading modern Jewish scholars who wrote on Flavius Josephus, and I was struck by a superfluous comma. Namely, if you look at the passage which you can see here, I give you the copy of the text, and I transcribed it above. In the German it is, wegen dieser zweideutigen Haltung lähmte die Bewegung anstatt den Nachdruck zu geben. And there shouldn't be a comma after zweideutigen. Yes. In English, that's because of this ambiguous attitude, he paralyzed the movement instead of pushing it forward. This is referring to Josephus' role as being the commander of the Jewish rebel forces against Rome in the Galilee in late 66 and early 67 CE. And Graetz is saying that Josephus wasn't really committed to the rebellion. His attitude was zweideutig, ambiguous, and therefore this held up the rebellion instead of pushing it forward as a governor ought to do. And I was reading that and I noticed the comma, and I wondered what caused that comma, and had I just shrugged my shoulders and say, things happen when you're publishing, that this whole evening would not have come about, and many other things on the way would not have come about. But what I did is I went and I looked to see the previous edition of the same book. Because I was reading as it happened, and I hadn't had any thought about it, was the third edition of 1878 of Graetz's Geschichte der Juden, Volume 3. And I went and I looked for the preceding version, and what I found was one more word. And that other word it was which generated the comma. Namely, in 1865, Graetz had written, in 1863, I'm sorry, Graetz had written, wegen dieser zweideutigen, verräterischen Haltung lähmte die Bewegung anstatt den Nachdruck zu geben. He characterized Josephus' attitude not only as being ambiguous, but as being treasonous. Josephus is a general for the Jews, he should be working for the Jews, and his attitude was so ambiguous that Graetz in 1863 characterized it as being treasonous. And now we understand that what happened between 1863 and 1878 is that Graetz, in rereading his second edition, in creating the third edition, he made a mark to strike out the word zweideutig, and he either he didn't knock out the comma, or he did, but the guy who worked in the printing house didn't notice it. I would love to find Graetz's own copy of the 1863 edition, but I was not able to do so, but I'm very certain that that's what happened. And the comma remained as evidence that there had been something changed in the text, which, for an historian, gives birth to the question, so why did he strike out the word? Why did Graetz in 1863 feel comfortable characterizing Josephus as a traitor, and in 1878, coming up to 1878, he did not want to? But first, to see if this is something significant or not, I started comparing the chapter on Josephus in these two editions more broadly, and I found that this was in fact a consistent change that Graetz introduced between the two editions. In 1863, Graetz refers to Josephus's leaning toward the nation's enemies. It's about as treasonous as you can get, and he simply omitted that statement in the parallel text in 1878. In 1863, Graetz accepts Josephus's own report about himself in his autobiography, The Life, the Vita, 175, where Josephus reports that he told Jewish aristocrats in the Galilean city of Tiberias that, you know, we can't win this war. We cannot withstand Rome. In other words, Josephus admits to the impossibility of the rebellion in 1863. And in 1878, Graetz quotes the same statement and says it was not true. In other words, Graetz claims that Josephus in his autobiography poised as if he had lacked confidence about the rebellion against Rome, but in fact he didn't. So he's leaning over backwards to say that Graetz was not treasonous, that Josephus was not treasonous. Or again, in Life 78, Josephus says that he warned his subordinates not to make war against the Romans. And Graetz simply omits this. And if you take the two volumes, you can actually see how sometimes he had to add some more words to pad the text to make sure he could fill out the lines. Some of you may remember putting text like that together before we had computers to do it for us.
Sorry, to be clear, when you say in 78, he says it's not true, does he say that Josephus knew this statement to the Tiberian aristocrats not to be true?
He's saying that Josephus writes that he said this to the Tiberian aristocrats, but it's not true. Graetz says Josephus could not or did not say that to the Tiberian.
The event never happened.
Exactly.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
So between omitting things or denying things, Graetz is doing things which all are consistent with the basic change with which I began, namely his omitting the characterization of Josephus as a traitor. As you see, I wrote a little article about this. I talked about putty in his hands, how Graetz is playing with Josephus the way it's appropriate in 1863, the way it's appropriate or useful for him in 1878. And I was wondering, why would he do such a thing? And while I was wondering, I realized something else was going on between these editions, which I noticed long before, but I didn't put it together with anything else. I just simply noticed it, but now it all started to fall into a package. Namely, Graetz, as you may know, wrote 11 volumes of Geschichte der Juden, History of the Jews from the most ancient times until the modern period. And each of the volumes has a left-hand title page with the name of the whole series, Geschichte der Juden, von den ältesten Zeiten bis auf die Gegenwart. And then the right-hand title page gives the name of the particular volume. What you see here on the screen is the first edition of the third volume of Graetz's history, and it's the edition which is the heart of the Second Temple period. And as you see, it's Geschichte der Juden seit dem Tode Juda Maccabis bis zum Untergang des jüdischen Staates. So it's the history of the Juden until the Untergang des jüdischen Staates, the end of the Jewish state. That's the way the book was entitled in the first edition. And things stayed exactly the same in the second edition in 1863, the one we were looking at.
When did Graetz write this volume?
The first volume was 1855 or 1856. It has different printings. This is the 1856 one. Then 1863 was the second edition, and the title remained the same. But in 1878, the edition in which we found him improving Josephus's image, the title of the volume changed to Geschichte der Juden, the history of the Judeans, not the Juden, seit dem Tod der Juden Maccabäus bis zum Untergang des jüdischen Staates. Namely, he has switched his terminology, and in this case, not only in the title page, but imagine this, in the age before computers, they changed every single noun and every single adjective in the book, from Juden and Judish to Judea and Judaische. It was a tremendous amount of work and very gründlich. I didn't find any cases in which they failed to do it. Graetz changed his terminology of the people of whom he's writing, thereby creating this difference. It's the only volume like this, where on the left is Geschichte der Juden, but on the right it's of this particular period. He's calling them by another name. You have to wonder why. And I told you, for years I was wondering why, and I didn't really have any great ideas. And then I started noticing how he was turning Josephus away from being treasonous, and that things started occurring to me. And what first occurred to me as an hypothesis was that by 1878, Graetz was sensitive about talking about any Jew as having been a traitor, because a traitor is somebody who's supposed to owe allegiance to the country of which he is a subject or a citizen. And maybe Graetz was sensitive about this because Heinrich von Treitschke had been attacking the Jews for wanting to be Jews and have all the advantages of being German. And that was something which basically characterized the Jews as being verräterisch, as being treasonous, and the word appears often enough. And von Treitschke, in fact, famously started this off in his major attack on the Jews, which focused on an attack on Graetz, as we will see, in 1879. And that was a problem because it's a year after Graetz made all the changes in his book. So my original hypothesis, before I went to see when these things happened, was that maybe Graetz was responding to von Treitschke's attack on the Jews by sanitizing his history and getting rid of a Jewish traitor, because we don't want to hear about Jewish traitors. But when I realized that, in fact, von Treitschke wrote in 1879, there's a problem. And while everybody recognizes that von Treitschke's attack on the Jews was very successful, and it gave rise to what's called the Berliner Antisemitismusstreit, which made, as Mommsen put it, it made anti-Semitism salonfähig, something you could do in respectable frameworks, because even professors and major journalists are doing it. It's not just something the people do, the people in the streets do. But it came too late. Okay, so it can't really explain the changes Graetz was making. But it's close. So I started wondering, how about precedents? Von Treitschke was a very prominent person. I will give you some examples. Historische und politische Aufsätze in 4 volumes appearing in the 80s, and his history of Prussia. And he's the editor of the Preußische Jahrbuch, where he published his attack on Graetz. So maybe this is what gave this its impetus. Somehow the guy is so important, maybe he was talking to other people, and Graetz heard about it even before he published his article. His article, in any case, which started things off, is one which has great historical significance. Not only did it give rise to the Berliner Antisemitismusstreit, it also formulated a particular sentence. His attack on the Jews, which focused on Graetz, says that, as a matter of fact, all over Germany we hear as from one mouth, the Jews are our misfortune, die Juden sind unser Unglück. And as you probably know, that's the line which appeared on the front page of every issue of Der Stürmer when it began to appear in the 1930s. I believe it began in the 1930s. In any case, certainly in the 1930s, Der Stürmer had this as its slogan. Which means that, to some extent, the origin of modern German anti-Semitism, which was respectable modern German anti-Semitism, allows for a straight line to be drawn from 1879 to the Holocaust. Now, it's not the only line, but you can get directly from von Treitschke's article to the major slogan of the major Nazi newspaper of the period in which all this happens. I started following this up. We still remember that comma. Yeah? Started following this up. And you want to know, okay, why then did von Treitschke attack the Jews? What catalyzed that attack on the Jews? And there's a letter which has been found and published in which von Treitschke actually reports that what caused him to attack the Jews in 1879 was reading a volume of Graetz's 11th volume of his Geschichte der Juden. He's on vacation in Switzerland, in Zug. He says, Ich habe hier oben den 11. Band von Graetz Geschichte der Juden gelesen und finde kaum Worte, meinen Ekel auszusprechen. I'm totally disgusted by the 11th volume of Graetz's Geschichte. The 11th volume is the last one, talks about modern period, down to the middle of the 19th century, and this he's writing in the summer of 1879, and a couple of months later he publishes, in November of 1879, his attack on the Jews. That, however, makes questions. I don't know how many of you have ever been on vacation in Switzerland, but the local Dorfbibliothek or Gemeindebibliothek does not have volumes of Graetz's Geschichte to read. So one question, which I put on the table, is how could Graetz be responding to von Treitschke if Graetz's third edition appeared in 1878 and von Treitschke wrote only in 1879? And the second question is, where did von Treitschke get a copy of Graetz's volume 11 in the Swiss mountains? And some of you are smiling already. This is the type of thing scholars do. But, I've spent enough time on vacation in Switzerland that the question interested. My wife is from Basel. So maybe von Treitschke's thoughts about the Jews were in the air already before he read Graetz. Maybe they were in the air already before 1879, and Graetz could respond to them. And there is some evidence for the antecedents of the Berliner Antisemitismusstreit. There is evidence that already in the 1870s, people are starting to talk more about Jews in a negative way in Germany. And I bring you here some representative scholarship. People are talking about 1873, people are talking about 1875. If you look at the third item, you have Yaakov Katz. On the preparatory stage of the modern anti-Semitic movement, 1873 to 1879, in other words, he's recognizing that things really began in 1879, but it began in a preparatory way already in 1873. So maybe things are in the air already. Some people attach it to the stock market crisis in Germany in 1875. Whatever, one way the things are in the air. Here's the page where somebody's collecting some of this evidence. You can get the feeling when you're looking at this. First, Gründungsschwindel, a book about the Gründungsschwindel, the cheating at the stock market in Berlin and attributing it to the Jews. We have here a book on the Sieg des Judentums über den Germanentum. Somebody's complaining about the Jews having defeated the Germans, and it's already in 1875. So things are happening. But turns out there's something much more specific. Namely, already in January of 1871, before the dates which were just mentioned, in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War, which began the previous July, a similar attack upon Graetz and the Jews had appeared in an angry three-column review of Graetz's 11th volume. That's the volume that von Treitschke was angry about. A review appears in January of 1871 attacking the Jews. It's an angry one. We'll see some of the text of it as we go on. As is often the case in 19th century, the review is not signed. It's initialed. It's signed by M.L. We know from Graetz's memoirs that he was very angry about the review and he didn't know who wrote it, and he thought it was Maurice Lasserus or somebody else. He didn't know. I know who it was. I'll tell you in a moment. It's signed by M.L. And, for example, in this last part of the article, which I bring you a copy here, you can see if you read the small print that the author is very interested in details of military history. This is what the author is very interested in. He's saying here that we have a question about how many Jews were part of the German army in the war against Napoleon, how many bought their way out of being in the army. And he's quoting people and saying, you see, I'm right and you're wrong. And now, es wird also Sache der Verfasser sein, die bis jetzt zurückgehaltene Beweise beizubringen. If he claims something else, he ought to prove what he has to say. So the author doesn't like Graetz, doesn't like Jews. We'll see it as it go on. But he is particularly interested in military history. And I started walking around the corridors of Hebrew University and asking people whose name was ML was very interested in German military history in 1871. And not too many people are interested in questions like that, but in very short order, a German historian at the Hebrew University, von Krefeld, told me he doesn't know, but he bet his friend Stowasser in the American Air Force Academy will know, because he spends his time on things like that. And I write a letter to Stowasser in the American Air Force Academy, and I get back an email letter 20 minutes later. Oh, that would be Max Lehmann, because Max Lehmann was writing about military history. Max Lehmann, who lived between 1845 and 1929 and eventually became a professor in Göttingen, a professor of modern history. And one can identify him as the author once you have a hint and you know what you're looking for, because he focuses on military matters, which is his field. Once you know what to look for, you look for Lehmann's autobiography. And like professors elsewhere, he wrote about himself. And he complains that in the early 1870s, he was wasting too much time writing book reviews for the Literarisches Zentralblatt Deutschland, for Deutschland, which is where I found this review, because he was being paid to write these reviews, and he needed the money. But he complains about how much time writing these reviews took from him. And in particular, after I wanted to be sure he's the person, I've located 50 reviews written by Max Lehmann in this journal over a 4 or 5 year period, and I read them all. And I was looking for indications that he would be the author. And what I found is the following. In his review of a book on Kaiser Friedrich I, by Putz, somebody by the name of Putz, ML complains that the so-called Annales Colonizenses, Maximi, has been the subject of a detailed study which is not unknown to the author. The author cites it on page 401. Who nowhere argues with its findings, of which the main one is that until 1164, the data in that chronicle are hardly worthy of belief. But nevertheless, Putz cites data from the chronicle without hesitation, so that one might suspect that he did not read the whole study. So, first of all, ML complains that Putz cites a book which says that a particular historical source is unworthy of belief, and nevertheless cites the source, which suggests he didn't really read the book he cites. Then he says, it is the same with Pfarrertrans Christian von Mainz. Putz cites it, but on page 343 refers to the Archbishop as if he were Graf von Buch, without any consideration for Pfarrertrans' counter-arguments. And when you read that, you wonder, why did he give us the name of the author in his second complaint, and not give us the name of the author in his first complaint? And you already suspect what the answer is, but you find Putz's book, and you go to page 401, and you find on page 401 that Putz is citing Lehmann's dissertation. So you understand, wouldn't have been polite for Lehmann to say, he cites my book but ignores it. So he says he cites an important book. So if you follow it up, you have 100% proof here that ML is Max Lehmann. And here's that footnote from Putz's book, and it's referring to Lehmann's doctoral dissertation. And this is Lehmann's doctoral dissertation, which, as you see, is precisely about that Cologne chronicle that Putz had been citing. A Berlin dissertation of 1867, written by Max Lehmann. And now this goes in two directions. My problem was why Graetz changed his mind about Josephus. My hypothesis was it had to do something with von Treitschke. Isn't it interesting that when you read Lehmann's autobiography, and when you read things about Lehmann, you discover very easily that Lehmann had a close relationship with von Treitschke beginning in the 1870s. In the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, you can find tens of letters from each to the other. Von Treitschke is older than Lehmann. Lehmann is very respectful to von Treitschke. Von Treitschke uses him as something of a research assistant, and sometimes that was even formalized, sometimes he was doing him favors, but it was worth the while of the younger person to do favors for the senior professor, and he was doing them. Lehmann talks about visiting von Treitschke frequently. Von Treitschke writes to his publisher in 1876 to explain why he's late with a manuscript, and saying that what can I do? And thanks to the kindness of Max Lehmann, I've received several very interesting papers, and it's taking me time to finish my rewriting of my manuscript on the basis of this. Lehmann eventually dedicates his book on Scharnhorst, yes, 19th century German general. He dedicates his book on Scharnhorst to von Treitschke in thanks and in love. And when there was a going away party for Lehmann in 1888, they sat side by side at the head of the table. They were very close together, the two of them. Well, now I know that Lehmann wrote a very angry and nasty review of Graetz in 1871, which means that he owned a copy of Graetz's 11th volume. That's the way book reviews are done. Those of you who might not know it, a publisher publishes a book, sends the book to the journal gives it to a reviewer, the reviewer gets a free copy of the book and maybe is paid as well in return for writing a review which is published in the journal. So now I started looking for Lehmann's copy of Graetz. In the library of Göttingen University, where Lehmann eventually became a professor, and you know that when professors die, frequently their books go into the university library, so that's why I looked there. I found, or actually a late friend of mine found for me, Lehmann's review copy of Graetz, Geschichte, volume 11, with his penciled marginalia corresponding to themes in the review. So here you see, this is the book he had in front of him. He read it, he made his penciled marginalia, and then eventually he sat down, collected his notes from the margins, and wrote his review. That's how people do it. And these notes are in pencil. They include things like the Juden sind ein Staat im Staate, the Jews are a state within the state, which is a typical complaint of anti-Semites. He puts a question mark, an exclamation mark in the margin when he's unhappy with Graetz's statements at this point. He puts quotation marks around the words he's unhappy with. And then these things eventually are collected and come to be parts of his review. But what was interesting is that you can also find marginalia in ink in the book. Now my friend in Göttingen went to the Göttingen archives, and he was able to prove without any doubt that the handwritten comments were by Lehmann, because there are plenty of handwritten documents by Lehmann in the Göttingen University Library. I got the people in Göttingen to agree to lend the book to me and take to Berlin. Huge procedure for a German library, but it happened. And there, somebody was writing a doctorate on von Treitschke, sat down with a lamp and a magnifying glass, and told me very conclusively that the ink-written marginalia were by von Treitschke. Which means, just imagine this, the younger scholar, Lehmann, he wrote in a pencil. He lends the book to his mentor, von Treitschke, and he uses a pen to write his comments there. And you have him making comments, and lo and behold, just about all of von Treitschke's comments are on pages where Lehmann has comments. So you now understand that what happened was that when von Treitschke was writing his history of Germany in the 19th century, and he had to say something about the Jews, he borrowed from his friend the copy of Graetz volume 11, and he thumbed through it and looked here and there, and the friend probably gave him a copy of his review as well. And this means that if we want to understand, yes, I skipped ahead and then got confused here. Let's not skip ahead. Let me just show you this chapter, this for a moment. If you look at what von Treitschke wrote in 1879, and you look at what Lehmann wrote in 1871, and you look at the comparisons between the things that are in bold letters in both of them, and the comparison between the things which are underlined, you will see that what's going on here is that von Treitschke was basically following the lead which had been set by Lehmann. Man lese die Geschichte von Graetz, welcher fanatische Buch gegen den Erbfeind des Christentums. And here we have, dass der Verfasser aus Eifrigen, um nicht zu sagen fanatische Jude aller Orten, einen erbitten Hass gegen das Christentum zur Schau trägt, ist begreiflich. So the opening of the section is the same. And then we have viel bemerkenswerte, Raymond says, sind seine Ansichten über unser Volk. It's, what he has to say about our people, and he compares them to the French Jews. Ist wirklich so kurzsichtig, nicht zu bemerken, welche Waffe da in seinem Gegend die Hände verhob. How can Graetz possibly allow himself to express such hostility towards the Germans? Does he not realize what kind of reactions this is going to allow? How can Graetz so überschätzt, how can he so over-evaluate the role of the Jews in which he attributes to them, to Mendelssohn, to Berne, to Heine, the role of having been the educators of the Jews, and attributing to them das lebhafte, rücksichtslose Wahrheitsgefühl und den Freiheitsdrang verdanken die Deutschen größtenteils diesen beiden Juden. Berne war mehr als Lessing. Unternahm nicht wenig als das deutsche Volk zu erziehen, as if Graetz is saying that the Germans learned their wonderful style and their way of thinking and presenting their thoughts from the Jews. What kind of nerve does he have to do that? And we have, especially a word like this, Selbstüberschätzung corresponds here to the Überschätzung. Where do we have it here? Self-Überschätzung.
Bedeutet Männer überschätzen.
Yes, here. When philologists see things like this in two parallel columns, and you have the explanation of how it could have happened, that one was simply writing on the basis of the other, my conclusion is that, in fact, one did write on the basis of the other. Had Lehmann not written his review of Graetz, had Lehmann not lent his copy of Graetz to von Treitschke, von Treitschke would not have written what he wrote. He might have written something else. But what he did write, we know, had a huge impact on what happened a couple of generations later. It made modern German anti-Semitism salonfähig. Had he not had that book up there in the mountains, then he wouldn't have this ekel against the Jews, and he wouldn't have written his major attack on Graetz a few months later. Who knows how things might have happened? Now, I'm not saying that the Holocaust would not have happened had not all of this happened. I'm saying the way it happened is this way. Maybe it would happen another way. I alluded to this before when I talked about reasons and circumstances. The circumstances in which modern German anti-Semitism took off and put on the table the Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune, are these circumstances. Because Max Lehmann was friendly with Heinrich von Treitschke and had been making a living by writing book reviews, and one of them happened to be on Graetz, and one thing led to another like that. Which means that to understand what engendered von Treitschke's 1879 attack on Graetz and the Jews, which is what engendered the birth of respectable German anti-Semitism, we must also, there are other factors in the world, understand why Lehmann wrote the way he did about Graetz and the Jews late in 1870. The article was published in January of 1871. The way things worked, he must have written it late in 1870. So let's talk a little bit about Max Lehmann. I told you before he became a professor of modern German history at the University of Göttingen. When you start looking at his Lebenslauf, his list of publications, his career, something immediately strikes you. Why did Lehmann move from medieval German history and its Latin historiography? You saw his dissertation was about a chronicle of the Middle Ages, written in Latin. Why did he move to 19th century Prussian history especially military history. His main publications are, on the one hand, the dissertation which we've already seen, and then Knesebeck und Schön, Beiträge zur Geschichte der Freiheitskriege. Freiheitskriege means the war against Napoleon, beginning of the 19th century. Steiners und Schön, ein Schutzschrift, namely, again, early 19th century. Then he became the editor of Preußen und die katholische Kirche. Then he wrote his big biography of Scharnhorst, general in the war against Napoleon. Friedrich de Grosse, Freiherr von Stein, der Hegel from 1813. And finally, a book on Bismarck. His career changed now. I did a doctorate in ancient Jewish history, and even though I mess around with other things, I stayed in ancient Jewish history. It's a big deal to change the field in which you work, the language in which you work. He worked in Latin, medieval historiography, and he moved into 19th century German history, especially military history. And the move was very complete. This is a list of his publications as he himself gave it a couple of years before he died. And again, here we have two publications, his doctorate and one other in 1869 on things in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. And afterwards, I just colored in yellow the dates that appear in the title so you can see 1795, 1870, 1813, 1793, 1815, 1810. That's what we just saw in a more detailed way. That's what there is. And you wonder, what happened? Now, this doesn't have to have anything to do with the other questions we've been asking, but there's something of a web here. Something was going on, and since I was still trying to figure out the whole story, I started pursuing that. And it became very interesting very quickly. First of all, because a number of German reference works claim that Max Lehmann was Jewish. Sounds like a Jewish name. Turned out that was simply a dead end. Turned out there were two Max Lehmanns born in Berlin in 1845, and one of them was Jewish and one was not, and our guy is the other one. He was born non-Jewish. It took a whole lot of work to find that out with the help of the baptismal records from Berlin, but I could figure that out. So I'm not going to pursue that at all. What changed in 1870? Why did Lehmann abandon medieval studies, and why did he write with such hostility about Greats and the Jews? The search for answers led to the story of Philipp Jaffé, who I haven't mentioned yet, who was Lehmann's teacher and doctoral advisor, and apart from people in medicine, was the first Jewish professor at the University of Berlin. That's a big deal. The first Jewish professor at the University of Berlin. Now, Jaffé committed suicide in April 1870, half a year, let's say, before Lehmann wrote his review. And he committed suicide during, and probably on account of, a long feud between him and Georg Heinrich Graetz. So here you have these two pictures. I've just changed gears, yes? Instead of talking about Lehmann, let's talk about Lehmann's teacher, who was Jewish, Philipp Jaffé. This turned into a major project. I eventually published a book about it because I looked for and found numerous letters. When you read something like that, the one thing you wonder is, why did Jaffé commit suicide? And what does this have to do with his student, who had been his disciple and his collaborator? What does this have to do with him writing so angrily about the Jews a few months later? What I'm going to tell you now reminds me of a statement in a book called The Academic Marketplace, which says that academic feuding deserves investigation in its own right. It can be very interesting. Professors like to sit around tables and talk about who's feuding with whom, and sometimes you can see it happening. And here I'm talking to you about a feud. Yes, you know what a feud is, a Fehde in German, between Jaffé and Graetz. Graetz was a good bit older than Jaffé. He was a well-established scholar when Jaffé came around. And to begin with, Jaffé worked for Graetz. So in 1845, Jaffé dedicated a book to Graetz. Graetz was the main librarian in the Royal Library in Berlin. He helped Jaffé, who was then a young student, get the books he needed to write his doctoral work. And Jaffé dedicated his book to Graetz. He thanked him effusively in another book in 1851, and he worked for almost a decade at the Monumento Historica. I have the picture yet? It's coming soon. The Monumento Historica is a project of publishing historical works which began under Pertz's directorship early in the 19th century and exists until today. It's published hundreds of volumes until today. Jaffé worked there at the Monumento for almost a decade. But Jaffé was very good at his work, very productive. And by 1862, a job offer came to him to run an archives by himself in Italy. And he was very enthusiastic about the offer, and then the offer disappeared. Nobody talked to him again. He knew there was an offer out there, and then nothing happened. It went away. And in 1862, Jaffé discovered that the offer had gone away because Pertz had convinced the Italians that they didn't really want Jaffé. And he was, of course, very angry, and he gave notice, and he quit, and his friends, including Mommsen and von Ramke, set him up a job at the University of Berlin, and that's how he became the first professor, a Jewish professor at the University of Berlin. And their feud included lots of very nasty publications, back and forth. Footnotes, book reviews, letters, public proclamations. I'll show you some examples in a minute. Especially this feud was interesting because Mommsen was involved in it. Mommsen even then was a major character in German academia. Eventually became one of the most major people in German academia until he finally got the Nobel Prize towards the end of his career. He set up for Jaffé a publication project that competed with the Monumenta. And you'll see that in a moment. Mommsen had his own reasons not to be happy about Pertz. Pertz was getting old. Pertz was getting very protective of the materials he had, and Mommsen wanted access to things he wasn't getting. And Jaffé's feud with Pertz fell into the same context as Mommsen's feud with Pertz, and that's part of the reason why Mommsen was acting as his ally. Things got to be so bad that in 1869, Jaffé basically published something which in American Western we would say he challenged Pertz to a duel. Yes, he published a flyer, which you can find in archives all over Germany today. He sent it to all of his friends, and it ended up in archives all over Germany, in which he is claiming that I hereby say that the man who writes those things about me is someone who is totally without air. He's totally without honor, and he is a dishonorable slanderer, einen ehrlosen Verleumder. Jaffé was getting very angry. I don't know of any direct effect of a publication like that, but imagine if you're walking around academia and somebody is passing out copies of things like this on the street. It's not very good. Everybody's getting angry. The real basis for the anger was the competition, because when Jaffé quit the Monumenta, having worked there for 9-10 years and knowing how things are done, he set up his own project with Mommsen's help. And therefore, for several years, you have, parallel to the Monumento Historica, you have the Bibliotheca Rerum Germanicarum, which was explicitly set up to show how things should be done, as opposed to the crummy way they're being done by those amateurs over there at the Monumenta. So every time, and both of these projects are publishing medieval German texts in Latin and writing annotations and introductions. And as you can imagine, Jaffé's introductions to the text, some of which had already been published in the Monumenta, his introductions focus frequently on what's wrong with the edition of the text as it appeared in the Monumenta. Jaffé put out 6 volumes. And they could be very nasty polemics. And here you have an example of the polemics on both sides. On one hand, you have Pertz writing about Jaffé. In a review of a volume of Jaffé's Bibliotheca, Pertz notes that he would not have mentioned a certain mistake, an orthographic mistake, spelling mistake, were it not for the need to show the truth to die Schüler aller Orten, who sing the praises of their prophet, and ascribe him total sovereignty concerning all aspects of medieval documents. So Pertz is complaining that there are people who look at Jaffé as if he is a prophet and infallible And therefore, he has to show even these petty mistakes that Jaffé has made. And those who know, and you have to be an old German to recognize the quote, but the 19th century literate people knew what this was. You know what Vivian is from? Die Schüler aller Orten is what you have in Faust, where somebody's complaining about a charlatan who holds himself out as if he is a very wise person, and die Schüler aller Orten are taken in by him and believe that he really is very smart, but in fact he isn't all that smart at all. Jaffé, for his part, publishes one of the more famous Latin texts of the early Middle Ages, which have been published many times. And in the introduction, he says it's been edited many times in the past, and that Pertz's edition, what Pertz did himself in the Monumenta, is the most wretched of all of them, the worst of them all. And he adds then, I have to be fair, after I've said that, I have, of course, to justify that. And therefore, he gives a list of 20 mistakes in Pertz's edition. And he loves doing this. Yes? They're back and forth to each other, many other things like this. Lehmann had been Jaffé's prime disciple, his partner, his heir apparent. Jaffé writes in his memoirs he had expected to be appointed to be the head of the Bibliotheca when Jaffé got too old to do it, and he expected to be appointed to have Jaffé's position at the University of Berlin after Jaffé would have to retire. Pertz had planned for his son Karl to inherit the Monumenta. Lehmann's 1867 doctoral dissertation was a hatchet job on Karl's 1861 Monumenta edition of the Cologne Chronicle. See, before I just showed you Lehmann wrote a dissertation on a Cologne Chronicle. Now I add, that Cologne Chronicle had been published by the Monumenta in an edition done by Pertz's son. And Lehmann's dissertation, to a very large extent, is saying what was wrong with that edition, what should have been done otherwise, why this Karl Pertz, the son of Georg, is not an appropriate heir for it. And most particularly, in March 1870, a month before Jaffé committed suicide, Lehmann published a terribly nasty review of a book by Pertz Sr., Georg Heinrich Pertz. And the review by a 25-year-old guy of a book written by somebody who was well past 70. The review opens with, Die bekannten Tübingen Perzischen Geschichtsschreiber verleugnen auch dieser Brand nicht. That's the first sentence of an article of a review, which says, this volume isn't any better than any of the other trash that's been published by Pertz. Can you imagine the nerve? Can you imagine the hostilities? And can you imagine then, when 4 weeks later, Jaffé killed himself? I can talk about the particular reasons why he did it, but in the context of this feud, when Jaffé killed himself, Lehmann became, from one day to the next, an orphan in the academic world. He had a very, very specific set of skills. He knew how to edit German, Latin, medieval texts. He had had a job with Jaffé. The only other person in the world who did things like that was Pertz. And there was no way Pertz was going to be giving a job to Lehmann. Well, so when Jaffé killed himself, Lehmann was an orphan. He had no patron, no chance of finding employment in the only other institution in its field. He needed to find a new patron and a new field. And we're talking about then the very beginning of April 1870, 6 months before the review appeared, which I referred to you, of the 11th volume of Graetz. And when you look, you can find, for example, the letter which you have in front of you. I have here a facsimile of the original. I have a transcription of it here as well. I'll give you the English version. Lehmann, who was making money by writing reviews for the Zentralblatt, writes a letter in August of 1870 to the editor of the Zentralblatt. Just now I saw that my initials, ML, were omitted from my review of Treitschke's Historische und Politische Essays in the August 6th issue of your journal. I sent you a review. I signed it ML. For whatever reason, my initials didn't appear. The review appeared anonymously. although they were explicitly given in the manuscript. You would be doing me a great favor if you could bring them to the reader's attention in the next issue. This is extraordinarily important for me, for I wish to show the contents of my review all around. Now this is a little bit pathetic, yes? And the editor of the Centralblatt ignored it. Not the next week, not the week after, he never saw any reason to correct this. Big deal, a review appeared, a couple of columns, and they don't have the author's name, the world will go on turning without that. But for Lehmann, it was very important. And that's because what he wrote was very, very flattering about von Treitschke. He had written a review of von Treitschke's historical and political essays. Here you have the German, I'll read you the English. It begins like this. True, it is no longer the case that what many of our scholars know about Heinrich von Treitschke is only that he is a Prussian-leaning and not untalented publicist. He's getting to be well known. The rise of his reputation is best demonstrated by the flood of hatred with which he is persecuted whenever the German state, which is seeking to assert itself, has enemies. In other words, people will attack von Treitschke, they're attacking Germany. But only in the future will it be possible to appreciate his worth fully. Then even the most stubborn radical, who today makes the sign of the cross whenever he hears von Treitschke's name, as if it's the devil, will join us in the conviction that since the days of Ulrich von Hutten, such a voice has not been sounded in Germany. Heinrich von Treitschke surpasses Arndt in the extent of his knowledge, Gentz in the nobility of his disposition, Fichte in his art of description, his pure truthfulness and unflinched bravery. It's disgusting, right? All of this flattery. And then what happened to the poor guy? The review was published without his name. And he wanted to show it to people. He says it very clearly. I wanted to show the contents of my review all around. And you know who the main addressee of it was. Who did he want to know that he had written this? Von Treitschke. So, I've come basically to the end of my story. What happened, what really happened, was that there was a feud between medievalists, beginning in the 1860s, which had to do with who could edit medieval Latin texts about Germany better. That's what Peretz and Jaffé were arguing about. Jaffé thought he could do it better than anybody else. Peretz was happy to have Jaffé working for him as long as he did, and was very angry when Jaffé set up shop for himself and started competing with him. And they criticized each other in a very lively way, in a very acerbic way. Lehmann associated himself too closely with his advisor, his patron. He worked with Jaffé. He proofread for Jaffé. He did research for Jaffé. He co-edited things with Jaffé. And eventually, as we saw, he wrote a very, very nasty review, as if he were a soldier in Jaffé's army against Peretz. The result of all of that was that Lehmann found himself an orphan. Lehmann had to find for himself a new patron. The patron he decided to set his hopes on was von Treitschke. And how much of this was planned, how much of this just happened, found himself writing things which were going to be music to von Treitschke's ears. And these are the 1870s, the very foundation of the German Reich. And he's writing the type of things which you would expect a nationalist German to be writing at that time. And Graetz, who in his 1870 volume 11 had praised the French for liberating the Jews and complained about the Germans who had tried to reverse all of the progress which happened in Napoleon's days. Graetz was the target of Lehmann's criticism, and he expressed it in a very severe way. That turned into Lehmann's review. That created the circumstances which eventually will allow Lehmann's review and Lehmann's copy of Graetz to get into von Treitschke's hands. And von Treitschke wrote, on the basis of that, basically the same thing that Lehmann had written several years earlier, that he would never have written had his advisor not committed suicide because of arguments about who can edit medieval Latin texts better. Which means that we have an interplay here between reasons and circumstances. Yes? Is it the case that modern German anti-Semitism was born because people were arguing about who could edit better Latin text. No. But the way it was born has everything to do with that. And that's what I'm suggesting to you today. And finally, I'll just point out that none of this would have been discovered had we all agreed just simply to shrug our shoulders, as we usually do when we see an extra punctuation mark in something we're reading. So that's what I had to say. Here, by the way, you have a picture of Max Lehmann's tombstone in Göttingen. And what it says on the tombstone is, alles ist Frucht, alles Samen. Everything is fruit, everything is seed, which means everything impacts on everything. There's nothing that comes into the world with no antecedents, and there's nothing which happens in the world which has no consequences. He didn't know what I was going to write, but it has a lot to do with what I had to say today.